Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
When the world economy sneezes, India's bound to catch a cold.
So I do not think this slowdown in large measure is about what's happening globally.
Hi, my name is Milan Vaishnav with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm here today with Rathin Roy, Director of the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. Rathin, good to see you.
Good to see you.
So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the economy, and you've been very prolific in your writings. So I want to start with the recent news from the International Monetary Fund, which points to a global slowdown, of which India is not immune, it seems. And so I want to start off by asking you, is it the case that when you think about the current slowdown in India, that it is an example of, when the world economy sneezes, India is bound to catch a cold?
Before that, let me say, Milan, that the International Monetary Fund is normally the last person to notice what's perfectly obvious to everyone else. I think, most of the international community was well aware there's a global slowdown happening, but that's bureaucracy for you. What you said is not automatically true. For instance, in 2008, when there was a global,
yes,
I like to call it an Atlantic economic crisis, India, which is not part of the Atlantic, managed to weather it. So definitely when things happen globally, there are implications for India, but they're not of an order of magnitude that cannot be dealt with by policy. So I do not think this slowdown in large measure is about what's happening globally.
Okay, so that means that there's something happening that's either cyclical or structural. Without getting into that debate, one of the things I think most economists agree on is that India's slowdown is still a consequence of what has been called the twin balance sheet problem. Now, if you get to the twin balance sheet problem, this is something that people have been talking about now for 5 years, perhaps longer, where you have a public sector banking system which is weighed down by a lot of bad loans, and you have a lot of infrastructure, large companies which are weighed down by bad bets that went wrong, and a lot of debt. Is this still today one of the primary binding constraints on the economy? And if so, why is it still so after 5 years plus of recognition that this is a big problem?
Well, the twin balance sheet problem is certainly not the binding constraint. We'll come to that. But it does exist. And it exists because of a familiar problem in India, which is the clunkiness of finance, which not many people have commented on, which basically means that you put your bets in a certain sector because you're told that your infrastructure poor. So it's a no-brainer. You don't have railways, build them. You don't have roads, build them. Make some money, move on. Right? That sector fails for a variety of reasons, thereby increasing the cost of doing business across the economy even further than it otherwise would have, because people have made their plans based on infrastructure coming, which was claimed in the future continuous tense for many years, and it didn't come in the present tense, and therefore plans are impeded. Which means that if you solve this crisis, you would still have not solved the problem that infrastructure and the stuff that you invested in, where loans went bad, has not come to fructify, which is why loans have gone bad. So that supply side constraint will continue,
right?
And therefore just cleaning up balance sheets, though necessary, will not automatically solve the problem. Number two, this twin balance sheet problem, which one chief economic advisor popularized, and I think there's a lot of merit to it as a geography of the economy, does not explain why there are demand slowdowns in sectors which already have established plant sales linkages, cars, FMCG, etc., etc.
So let me just get to this point now, because many people described the state of the Indian economy up until, say, 6 months ago as kind of operating on a single engine, and that single engine was consumption. Now, what you're saying is that single engine, to put words in your mouth, is sputtering. So if that's the case, why is it so?
Oh dear. I've been saying this for 2 years, and I'm sorry to sound like Nostradamus. I said this 2 years ago and no one listened. But at least we have got that out of the way. If that engine is sputtering, Is it sputtering because of cyclical problems, because of external shocks, internal shocks? Possibly so in an exacerbating sense. But I think what has happened is that the basis on which domestic consumption, which has always powered India's baseline growth, has been aiding the growth process since 1991, that phase is over. Because to understand that very simply, go and ask someone in Mumbai, what are the leading indicators of the Indian economy? Now, in an economy of this size, you'd expect the leading indicators to be stuff that everyone consumes. Everyone consumes a nutritious meal, everyone consumes clothes, everyone consumes a house, or ought to, aspire to consume a house in their lifetime. Okay, not everyone, it's a poor country. Let's just talk about people earning the minimum wage, wherever they live, and more. So food, clothing, housing, some health, some education, and then a two-wheeler, maybe a cycle. These should be the leading indicators, but they're not, and they never have been. The leading indicators of this economy are automobiles, right? Fast-moving consumer goods, air conditioners, consumer durables, and more recently even air travel, which is not what a plurality of Indians earning the minimum wage or above, I'm not even discussing the poor as a source of demand. Now, the top 100, 150 million that demand these things, that's a large market, and that's been quite sufficient, in my view, over the last 20 years to power up the Indian economy to produce growth rates of 7 and 8. But that demand is now plateauing. A lot of the increased income there is going to discretionary consumption. Indians of that class now can take holidays abroad. Indians of that class can now drink alcohol that used to be produced in India, but we can't make malt whiskey. So if they move to making malt whiskey, we're going to have to import it. Indians of that class today, a senior level bureaucrat can well afford to send their child abroad to study, which means you import education. So discretionary imports, I think, are slowly but surely taking a large chunk of that. And that has not been replaced by providing the 5 things I mentioned at affordable prices to people earning the minimum wage.
But you're saying that had we been focused on those indicators, which affect the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, that evidence of the slowdown would have been discernible to us even 2 years ago. And then in some sense we've been misled by looking at the wrong set of indicators, autos, FMCG and other things.
Business is reactive. And again, not the bottom of the pyramid, this is very important, the middle of the pyramid. At the moment it's powered by the top of the pyramid. It's a big pyramid. So there are lots of people at the top. You wouldn't look at that because you would look at things that were powering your economy. It would require someone whose business it is not to look at indicators on a quarterly basis, economists like myself, to ask, but what's this fundamental question? Why these indicators? Right from the beginning, why these indicators? Why not indicators that reflect more broad-based consumption?
Right.
And any economist worth their salt will tell you that the day will come, and we can see this in South Africa, Brazil, the history of development is littered with examples of people who didn't pay attention to this. And India is the biggest, and therefore we have had time. We still have time, but we have to now have a change in demand composition. It cannot be the case that shirts such as the one I am wearing, which cost, this one is a half sleeve, it's a little cheaper, it costs about 2,000 rupees, $30, are 90-95% made in India. Marks and Spencer makes them in India. But shirts that cost 400 rupees, $4, $5 shirts, a majority of them are imported from Vietnam and Bangladesh. That's a classic example of the textile industry being productive when it produces for the top 150, but unable to move to the next round. So I think the common task, and this is way beyond government, government is not the economy. Such structural problems need to be addressed jointly by all stakeholders, industry, government, etc. They're not about spending money. And it'll take too long to tell you because each of these sectors I'm describing is held back for very specific and rather different sort of reasons.
Yeah.
But I think the time has come to establish a white paper, a task force. I've been working on this, and some progress has been made. Prime Minister Modi's assertion that we will now focus on doubling farmers' income is all about getting agriculture to produce at affordable prices, because you don't double income by subsidizing, you double it by making agriculture, the agriculture business, I want to use that dreaded word, a business that works for farmers. They don't commit suicide, or like us, regular guys. They go in there, they do a day's work, they make some money. When things are bad, they make less. When things are good, they make more. They have not been entitled to that since independence. Housing, moving away from this talk about low-cost housing to affordable housing. Affordable housing means like you or me, if we wish to buy a house, we make plans in our lifetime, we go to a bank, we borrow money, we put in our own money, we buy a house, and that's our life investment in housing. And we need to have that happening in the, 1,50,000, 15 lakhs, what is that? 1.5 million, 2 million rupee bracket. That's not been happening. The entire housing investment has been going into the 50 million plus bracket. But that's not what people who earn the minimum wage can afford. So this is not about the bottom of the pyramid. This is about the demand of people who are above the minimum wage and that not being met through domestic output. The supply response to this demand is lacking, and therefore I want to calibrate the traditional argument. It's not about supply response sui generis, one. Two, in this situation, expansionary fiscal policy, spending more money is not going to work. This is not a Keynesian problem, it's a structural demand slowdown.
So one question I get a lot from people who are not based in India, and as a non-economist, I'm not qualified to answer, so let me put it to you, which is, to the extent people have been tracking this government in its first 5 years, one thing that they all know is that there's been a heavy emphasis on the construction of assets, particularly in rural areas. So whether it's rural roads, whether it's toilets, whether it's gas connections, whether it's electricity connections, whether it's bank accounts, you know, this has been a signature hallmark of the welfare policy of Modi 1.0. Now, why isn't it the case that the construction of those rural assets, we can disagree about how the numbers inflated or the numbers deflated, but I think most would agree that there's been significant progress. Why haven't those things translated to an increase in rural incomes that could then lead to consumption growth?
For that, we have to understand that many of the things that you're talking about are delivering what was previously promised to be delivered and not delivered. So what you did was you hired the people to build a road. You tendered for the capital equipment, the road did not get built. So what has happened is the execution success of this government has gone up. So what happened earlier was people were getting paid and no roads were getting built. Now people are getting paid and roads are getting built. It's not that more people are being paid to build more roads. The other things you described, you used the word welfare, are absolutely right. Giving people gas cylinders does not create employment automatically. It might have second order effects, but it's not first order. Building toilets, again, there was a large toilet program, and one has to, I don't know, maybe they're not building something else. Maybe they're not building something wasteful. But building toilets, building statues, all these things do create employment. But it just may be that employment is coming from someplace else, because net public expenditure has not gone up.
Right.
You see, net public expenditure has not gone up. The size of the Indian central government, measured by what it spends as a percentage of GDP, has actually shrunk in the last 4 years, in line with the long-term trend. It was 21% of GDP in 1991. It is now 14%. It was 17% when this administration first took office in its first term. So with a shrinking state, it is obvious at a macroeconomic level that if you're going to spend more on X, if you're shrinking, you must be spending less on Y. That may be a good thing, but it's not going to add to employment in a Keynesian way.
Yeah. So one of the policy responses of this government in its 2.0 version, post May 2019, has been the introduction of a new corporate tax cut regime, which is something that many MNCs, many domestic companies, many ordinary Indians, economists have been calling for. This government had promised it for a long time, and now it's delivered. Does this have any bearing on the demand side problem? One of the critiques of this is not the correct instrument to get a demand side impulse.
Let me point out that the tax cuts were not intended to solve a temporary demand problem. They have been part of the policy of the previous administration. Unfortunately, not executed at the speed at which it ought to have been. Late Finance Minister Jaitley announced this very policy 3 years ago, and I remember writing nice things about it. But then execution did not happen. What has happened now, perhaps in response to the slowdown, is that execution has happened in 1 month. Though not completely or in full measure, because you still have a chance to take advantage of exemptions and not go for the lower tax rate. It's not a clean execution. Be that as it may, therefore, this was a supply side reform intended to make India more competitive globally, and therefore its impact will be felt later. Even if people gain from this in terms of lower taxes, this is what I keep explaining. We say in Hindi, "Do haath se taali bajti," which means government can do a lot with national security on its own. Unfortunately, the economy, the other people involved, and how they react matters. So I'm a firm. I get a tax cut, my profits go up. I can decide to keep those profits, distribute them as equity, or invest them. The first will do absolutely nothing to demand. The second will do something for some types of demand, depending on how my shareholders then decide whether to save the money or consume it, right? And the third, of course, will have a direct impact on demand depending on the capital intensity of the investment type. And I simply do not know how individual businesses that save money will take these decisions, because these will be very specific to their circumstances. Therefore, the answer, I'm afraid, must be what all economists give you. People don't like, but I hope you see the logic of why I'm saying this now. It depends.
That's a good note to end on. Rathin Roy, nice speaking with you.
Thank you.